Hi guys, it's Claire. Welcome back. Today I'm bringing you the first half of my April reading wrap-up, and April ended up being a real gangbusters reading month for me. So I'm splitting up my wrap-up again this month, and today I'll be talking about the bottom half of my April reading, although I do have some great books here, and then I will be back at you tomorrow with the best books I read this month. So let's get into it. The first book I read in the month of April was An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. So ever since watching some of Alex from Big Al Books' fantastic videos highlighting Indigenous writers and books about Indigenous history, I've been wanting to pick up more titles like that, and she does a fantastic job of highlighting writers from and books about First Nations history in Canada in particular, but I was looking for some books dealing more with Native American history from the United States, so I decided to pick up this one because it seemed like a good primer on that topic. And I haven't read any other comprehensive books about the Indigenous history of the United States, so I don't know how it compares to other scholarly works, but for a layperson like myself, I thought it did a fantastic job of explaining in detail the ways in which white settlers perpetrated settler colonialism across the United States. This book really elaborates the extent of the aggressive and purposeful and systematic annihilation of Indigenous populations from the United States. In that way, this book really undermines a lot of the American history that most of us are taught in schools, and it really drives home how things like American individualism and westward expansion and manifest destiny were reliant upon the extermination of native populations, and how in order to maintain our anti-colonial origin myth and sense of national identity as a land of freedom and equality, settler colonialism and the suffering of countless Native Americans has been written out of history. And while Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz does make a point of emphasizing that there are still Native populations living in the United States today and how theirs is a history of survival and endurance, I wish she had delved a little bit more into that living history, just because I think we have a tendency to regard Native American history as something that is past and no longer vital and relevant to today. But I do think this was a really valuable read and will provide a good foundation for moving forward and reading more about Native American history and also reading more from Indigenous writers. Switching gears a little bit, the next book I read was Conversations with Friends by Sally Rooney, which I have to say was probably the most forgettable book that I read this month, or at least the one that I had the most lukewarm reaction to. And this is a story that follows 21-year-old Frances, who is a writer and university student in Dublin, and it explores her complicated relationship with her best friend slash ex-girlfriend slash spoken word poetry partner, Bobby, and it also explores what happens when she and Bobby start spending time with an older poet named Melissa and her actor husband, Nick. And what this book really excels at is what its title is selling, and that is that it perfectly captures the kind of conversations you'll find among the highly educated, artsy, progressive set. These are characters who often talk about things like communism and how capitalism harnesses love for profit and how a certain person has an aesthetically beautiful laugh. And the dialogue and observations here are spot on, but they also feel like something I've already seen before in a number of books and TV shows and movies about millennial hipsters. This is the kind of self-aware skewering of one's own overeducated social set that you'll find in shows like Girls or in every Noah Baumbach movie starring Greta Gerwig. And it just seemed like nothing in this book was offering anything particularly new or insightful to that genre. And beyond the well-done observational elements of the book, I thought that the actual plot and drama within the narrative often felt quite pedestrian. A lot of the plot revolves around an affair that sometimes feels like you're reading a kind of trashy romance novel. And then in a kind of weird tonal shift in the back half of the book, she takes on all of these really heavy and serious subjects that include but are not limited to endometriosis, parental issues, faith and religion, self-harm, etc., etc. And I don't know, it just felt kind of messy and sort of rushed, and it felt like she was trying to add these serious elements to the book without really giving them the time or depth of exploration that they demand. So yeah, despite the highly readable quality of this book, I was not a huge fan, and I guess I'm just a little bit puzzled by the critical praise that it's gotten so far, because to me it didn't really seem like anything particularly special, but I also seem to be in the minority opinion on that. Next up, I have The Best We Could Do by Thi Bui, which is a pretty popular graphic novel in which Thi Bui retraces some of her family history and tells the story of how her family came to America after fleeing Vietnam in the 1970s. Thi Bui was quite young when her family fled Vietnam, so she doesn't have any really personal memories of that country or of that period in her family's history. So much of this book is her recounting her parents' lives growing up in French-occupied Vietnam, living through the war, and then making the harrowing escape from Vietnam to come and live in America. And you get the sense throughout this book that Thi Bui has a complicated and difficult relationship with both of her parents, and how through telling their story, she's making an effort to understand them more as people, and to understand how, despite the ways in which they may have failed her as parents, they really were doing the best they could do. And I enjoyed this book a lot, especially the ways in which it explored life in Vietnam during the 50s, 60s, and 70s from a Vietnamese perspective. And I don't read a lot of graphic novels, but the artwork in this book seemed to be fantastic, and it had beautiful images and some that were especially striking and visually arresting. In general, I loved all of the things that she explored in this book, but I sometimes wish that the conclusions she ultimately came to weren't quite so trite or heavy-handed. And if anything, I guess I just wish this book were a little bit longer, because I loved the ways that she explored her parents' lives in Vietnam and her family's early life in America, but then it felt like we were just missing the story of her adulthood, and if we had had more information about her relationship with her parents as an adult, then the end of the book might have felt more resonant and emotional. And lastly, I want to talk about Lust Caution by Eileen Chang, which is a collection that contains her short story of the same name along with 4 other Eileen Chang short stories. And if you tuned into my March reading wrap-up last month, you will know that I have recently become a hardcore Eileen Chang fan, and I am slowly working my way through all of her books that have been translated into English. So I was really happy to find a copy of this book, and Eileen Chang really does not disappoint with these stories, each of which is filled with the colors and sounds of World War II era Shanghai, and each of which is tense with emotional manipulations, double meanings, and the social maneuverings that are so emblematic of Eileen Chang's writing. I think the only thing working against this book is the fact that Eileen Chang has written even better stuff than what you'll find here, and if you're interested in her short stories or novellas, I would recommend Love in a Fallen City over this collection, although I really did like the title story in this collection and thought it was the best of the bunch. I think I also may have jumped the gun on this book a little bit, because after reading Half a Lifelong Romance and Love in a Fallen City by Eileen Chang, I went ahead and watched the 2007 Ang Lee film adaptation of Lust Caution, and I have to say, I think I liked the movie better than the story, which I know is blasphemous. They're both great, but the movie is really kind of everything you want in a film adaptation, in that it's faithful to its source material but also transcends it and is able to utilize what is unique and powerful about the medium of cinema, and the ways in which it makes explicit what is implicit in the story is really well done. So yeah, I do recommend Lust Caution if you're already an Eileen Chang fan, but if you're new to her work, I would recommend starting with Half a Lifelong Romance or Love in a Fallen City. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I mentioned here and if you have thoughts on them. Otherwise, I will be back at you tomorrow with the best books I read in April. As always, thanks so much for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time. Bye!